there are worrisome signs that New York was not going in the right direction. At some point, the music's going to stop, and we're going to all have to deal with the consequences of what's going on here. And then the music didn't just stop. Like, the music stopped, and the record was smashed, and the record player was thrown in the garbage.
Welcome to Post-Corona, where we try to understand COVID-19's lasting impact on the economy, culture, and geopolitics. I'm Dan Senor. Is New York over? It's a question that's hotly debated these days. We will return to this question from time to time over a number of episodes in the months ahead. Last week, we hosted two experts from the Manhattan Institute to look at the future of subways. On this episode, we look at Broadway, the industry of live theater, and arguably the beating heart of Midtown Manhattan. Broadway has become big business and a big employer. It's central to New York City's economy. Broadway has experienced skyrocketing growth over the past several decades. Think about this. In 1980, Broadway shows drew audiences of 6 million people, generating about $500 million in revenues. In 2019, pre-corona, Broadway attracted some 15 million theatergoers and close to $2 billion in revenues. And that doesn't even include all the other derivative jobs that are generated from millions of theatergoers attending shows each year. According to New York City's tourism agency, in a typical year, there are 66 million visitors to New York City, generating $70+ billion in economic activity and $7 billion in tax revenues. According to the organization Broadway League, close to $15 billion of that economic activity and 100,000 jobs here come from people going to shows and visiting restaurants, hotels, using transportation, and all the other local services tied to the theater experience. But on March 12th, the lights on Broadway went dark. The ecosystem of employees and employers that populate this live theater experience scattered. To help us understand the short history of Broadway's economic boom and where it goes from here, post-corona, is writer, public intellectual, and culture critic John Podhoretz. When will Broadway return? What would it take to bring it back? And what will Broadway look like when we get out of this mess? This is Post-Corona. I am pleased to welcome my friend John Podhoretz here today. Hi, John.
Hi, Dan.
I'm actually psyched I get to say hi, John, like back at you, because I'm used to you saying hi to everyone on the Commentary Magazine podcast every single day. So I get to do it right back at you. Welcome to Post-Corona. John, for our listeners, is the editor-in-chief of Commentary Magazine. I think one of the most important journals published in the United States today. I highly recommend it. He's the host of the Commentary Magazine podcast, which produces an episode every single day, 5 days a week. Used to just be a couple days a week, but then during coronavirus, they decided to go daily. He's a columnist for the New York Post, and he writes about politics and public policy and cultural life. And in another life, he not only co-founded the Weekly Standard, one of my favorite magazines, but he was the film critic for the Weekly Standard. And in almost every single issue, it was a weekly magazine, he produced a film review. John, how many film reviews have you written, like, in your career, at least through the Weekly Standard era?
Good guy. Close. Good. I mean, all in all, probably close to 1,000.
Close to 1,000, right?
Yeah.
So John basically was what they called the back half of the magazine, which was, to some, the most important part of the magazine. And he's also written a lot about theater, and he's written theater reviews, and he's written about the state of the theater world, both the cultural side of the theater world and the business side of the theater world. And he has been following pretty closely what's been happening to the theater world in this corona environment we're in, and thinking about where it's going, which he's written about for the New York Post. So, John, that's what we want to talk about today. So I just want to take you back to early March. So in early March of this year, there were over 30 productions running on Broadway, including 8 new shows and previews, And according to you, there were rehearsals, according to your writing, there were rehearsals for another 8 productions that were set to open just this past spring. And so that's early March. So everything's thriving. It was on March 1st that the first reported death of an American from coronavirus became known to us, and nobody was really paying attention. Dr. Fauci was not a household name. The big news on March 1st of that year was not that an American had died from coronavirus, but as Scott Galloway points out, the most important news on March 1st, according to the press, was that Mayor Pete had suspended his campaign. And then that's March 1st. And then March 12th, all these productions are suspended. So in a 12-day period, everything stops on Broadway. I want you to take us back to where you were at that time. So there you are, middle of March, and you hear Broadway goes dark. As someone who follows the theater world closely and writes a lot about it, was your reaction, oh, this is just a temporary blip? You couldn't imagine a million years that would actually have some kind of permanent cloud over it? Or did you sit back and say, wait a minute, this is really bad for the theater industry, and I'm not sure how this ends?
No, I certainly did not anticipate that we would be here at the end of 2020 with the central cultural product of the most important city in the United States and possibly the world shuttered, not only having been shuttered for almost 9 months, but shuttered indefinitely. When the theaters closed on March 12th, the idea was they were going to reopen a couple weeks later. And then there was a second suspension through April. It was not until May, I believe, that it became clear that they could not reopen, and that basically then, I don't think it was that nobody was paying attention to the coming of the coronavirus. As I recall, even at the beginning of March, people were starting to be somewhat hesitant about going out, about going to restaurants. People I knew who were restaurateurs or store owners were reporting, catastrophic fall-offs in their business as people were getting more and more anxious about infection and contagion. But certainly the depth and length of time of this cultural suspension was something I don't think anybody, that one person that I knew who was incredibly worried and taking unbelievably seriously the threat of the coronavirus was you. And I say this because you actually, I believe in part because of what you do for a living.
Yeah.
You were looking at this in terms of the macroeconomic impact and how to function in a new market environment. And I remember we had a friend who was scheduling a bat mitzvah, and I said, she's not going to have to cancel the bat mitzvah. And you were like, oh, yes, she, oh, you bet she is. And I'm like, oh, come on. It was like at the end of the month. Oh, come on. I mean, that's ridiculous. Obviously, okay, people will be careful. Right. They'll want to be careful like that. But you were like, you have no idea what's coming down the pike. So the person that I knew who was most concerned about this was you. So I don't think anybody in the theatrical community or anything like that had sort of thought through seriously the prospects of pandemic, although we know from theatrical history, and I'm talking about theatrical history dating back to the ancient Greeks, that theaters opened and closed based on plagues all the time. That was one of the things that...
During the Elizabethan theaters, there were plagues, threats of plagues, right?
Yeah, this is actually why there's still a person in London, there's still an official in London who has the authority sort of in and of himself to shut the theaters down. Because he basically is a sort of plague watcher. And so, yeah, I mean, the movie Shakespeare in Love takes place just as a plague is ending in Elizabethan England, and Shakespeare has writer's block. He's on the hook to write the play that's going to reopen the Globe Theater, and he can't do it because he has writer's block. So,
John, I just want to set the table here in terms of what the theater scene means for New York City's economy. Some of these numbers I went through in the introduction. So in a typical year, New York City receives about 66 million visitors to the city, which contributes 72, according to the New York City tourism industry, it contributes approximately $72 billion in economic activity and $7 billion in tax revenues. And where the theater industry fits in, the theater industry does about $15 billion in revenues per year and employs about 100,000 in a typical year, and employs about 100,000 people. So it's a lot of people. So this is like a new phenomenon that the theater scene is contributing these kinds of numbers to New York City's economy. Now, you've written that the path for this began in the 1990s. And before the 90s, Broadway was a much different place. It was dominated by Eurocentric productions, and it was nowhere near the big boom business that it is today. So, can you just first explain what was going on in that earlier phase, pre-90s, why it wasn't such a big industry, and then I want to talk about how it became a big industry.
Right. Well, so the numbers that you were citing, 15 billion and 100,000 jobs, that is, I think, a general number for everything that is related to or ancillary to theater. Because I think
people
the Broadway,
come in, they go to dinner before the theater.
They stay in hotels, and right. So because I think the Broadway theater itself, I think, generates about $2 billion in direct sales. Right. So $2 billion in direct sales, but in 1980, for example, it was 500 million. So over the course of 40 years, it quadrupled in size. And Broadway, before 1980, was famously thought of as the fabulous invalid, a weird, bespoke form of show business entertainment, often run by sort of eccentrics, weird producers, people who are sort of throwing stuff up to see how it would go, very hand-stitched, not very professional in the way that we sort of imagine American industries to be professional, much quirkier and individualistic. And then,
can I ask you, at that time, was part of the business launching shows in New York and then sending them on tours around the country?
Oh yeah, it still is. But I mean, a lot of this was just a kind of, as I say, like a hand carved industry dominated by creative people and eccentrics and a lot of people who were skimming money off the top and playing games with budgets and stuff like that. And then Broadway had also gotten into a much weakened position from where it had been 20 or 30 years earlier, because the neighborhood, Times Square, that hosts these, I think then there were 35 theaters, now there are like 40 theaters, had deteriorated, had become crime-ridden and pornography-riddled, and tourism was way down to New York because of crime and its bad reputation, and New Yorkers, people who lived in the suburbs, didn't want to come into the center city at night to go to the theater because it was dirty and dangerous. And so the theater had sort of gone into this secular decline that was reversed when shows like Cats and Phantom of the Opera and Les Miserables hit, all of which were not in the classic American musical form. They weren't sort of snappy, dancey comedies. They were much more sort of operatic, thematic, fake Puccini scores by Andrew Lloyd Webber, and more spectacle than they were plot-driven or comedy-driven or something like that. And that was what sort of saved Broadway from itself in the 1980s, but it was creatively kind of disastrous. And then
and back then, did it have a foreign invasion feel to it? Because
totally.
Okay.
Oh, totally. Not only did it have foreign invasion feel, there was a sense that like these largely British people, though Les Miserables was written by French composers and lyricists, were coming in. They wanted to come in. They wanted only to have British actors and performers in the shows, which was bad for American performers and for the Actors' Equity, the union that governed Broadway. And they were doing things their own way, and they none of this was sort of reproduce. Like there didn't seem to be any school that was being built by Andrew Lloyd Webber or something like that people could make shows in the model of, and this wasn't really sort of an American form. Something else was happening. So just as New Yorkers no longer wanted to go to the theater and tourism started growing again in New York, there was this kind of spectacle theater that was really good for tourists and foreigners, because in a lot of what you didn't need to know English to go to see Cats. First of all, you couldn't understand the words anyway, and second of all, it was mostly people walking around looking like cats and sounding like they were singing operetta. So it was kind of it was not in great shape, but it was sort of surviving. And then just around the time that the New York Renaissance began, right, which began in earnest in like the beginning of 1994. But there were, signs or traces of improvements or things on the margins in sort of a couple of years earlier. Just at that time, there was suddenly a creative resurgence in the American theater, and particularly in the Broadway theater. Both
one triggered by the other, or just fortuitous timing?
I think it's sort of, I don't want to compare it to, why was it that every genius in world history was born in Florence, within 20 years of each other. But it's sort of like you couldn't have one without the other somehow. New York couldn't have revived itself fully without the revival of this unique cultural experience that you really only can have in New York. Not that other cities don't have theaters and stuff like that, but the American theater is New York, and it is Broadway. And so New York, being New York, needed a healthy Broadway. And Broadway needed a safe New York. So somehow, the minute that all of this started to converge, it all just happened all at once. That's the weird part of it. And so by 1996, 1997, you had 7 or 8 different shows, American shows, that had opened that were massively successful. The Lion King, Rent, which was a show about New York in its darkest days. That's the funny part about it. Is Rent was a Broadway commodity show about junkies and strippers and people in S&M shows dying of AIDS on the Lower East Side. And then, basically people were buying, $50 T-shirts from Rent on Broadway.
It was made by this young guy, right? John Larson?
Yeah, this 35-year-old guy who, in a classic showbiz melodrama story, died 3 days before the show was about to open. He was 35 years old. He had an aneurysm and he died. And so that was part of the kind of mythos of Rent that made it this legendary show that exploded and, ran for 10 years and made scads of money and made Broadway interesting to an entirely new, younger audience.
But just so the show, so it's Rent, Chicago,
which was a revival of a successful but not very famous show from the 1970s. The play Angels in America, the 2-part play Angels in America, and then The Lion King, which by now, interestingly enough, 23 years after its opening, The Lion King is the single most successful entertainment franchise thing that has ever been made. It is the most
any genre of entertainment.
In any genre, the most successful single presentation in show business history. It's made something like $8.2 billion.
Wow.
The stage version. So, because there are 50 productions all over the world that never stop running. And it was inventive. It was a total reimagining of this very successful property, this Disney cartoon. But again, central to this mythos of Broadway in New York, The Lion King was staged in a theater, in a classic old theater from the turn of the century that had become totally dilapidated, had been a second string movie house and then briefly a porn theater called the New Amsterdam, and then it closed and it was shuttered. And Rudy Giuliani said to Michael Eisner, the head of Disney, this neighborhood will be cleaned up. You should buy this theater. I will make sure that there is no crime on your doorstep. And 3 years later, they opened The Lion King in the New Amsterdam Theater, in this magnificently restored theater. And there it is, this gigantic, imaginative success that that basically enshrines the fact that Broadway has now become a central key feature of the revivified New York. So that by that, and then, as the years progressed, then it became this center of American tour of New York City tourism.
And not just New York City tourism, but the industry. I mean, a typical year in recent years, these Broadway shows like Lion King, like you're mentioning, but it also happened to Hamilton. These shows they originate in New York, they become a big deal on Broadway, and then they send them touring around the country. So in recent years, you could have 40 plus Broadway shows touring in a given year to some 200 cities across the United States. The headquarters of that industry is New York City.
Right. And this fact that New York City has an industry that no other city has, this Broadway industry that throws off or, produces close to $15 billion in revenue and is directly or indirectly responsible for 100,000 jobs. Right? That's a feature of New York that no other city could possibly have. Only Los Angeles, because it is host to the motion picture industry, has anything remotely comparable to it.
So then take me to the more recent phase. So that's sort of there's the pre-rent, let's call it the pre-rent era, which is a Eurocentric era. Then you've got the Rent, Chicago, Lion King era. And then you get into the more recent era, which is Book of Mormon, Hamilton. I mean, talk about this more recent phase, because it feels like it went to a whole other level.
Right. The producers, Hairspray. So what you have is, despite 9/11 and obviously the horrors that visited on New York in 9/11, you have New York in a good mood, and New York is in a really good mood, and people are enjoying living here, and there's a lot of optimism and enthusiasm, and this is reflected in the spirit on Broadway, where shows open, people just sort of flock to them enthusiastically. The producers in 2001, Wicked in 2003, Hairspray around the same time, Mamma Mia, which was actually a London import, the Book of Mormon in 2010 or 2011, and then kind of culminating with this astonishing thing. Oh, and then the show In the Heights, which was the first show by Lin-Manuel Miranda, and then this astonishing feat, Hamilton, this 3-hour rap musical biography pageant about the founding of the United States and the founding father Alexander Hamilton, that becomes the first genuine cultural phenomenon to emerge from the new Broadway with far-reaching, the album sells to kids all over the country know about it, know who Alexander Hamilton is. Books about Hamilton start to sell. Lin-Manuel Miranda
hosts Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, and Lin-Manuel Miranda himself becomes a cultural touchstone.
Yeah, he's doing ads for American Express on television.
Yeah, and then when the pandemic hits, and it turned out that Disney spent $75 million buying just a filmed version of the stage show that had been filmed in 2016, was going to release it to theaters around Christmas time this year. When that didn't happen, when they knew that couldn't happen, and they decided to release it on July 4th during the pandemic, from what we can tell, because they don't provide honest reporting, that too was a cultural phenomenon. Tens of millions of people, if not more, watched it, subscribed to Disney Plus because of it, and all of that. So you have this, the theater, which is, of course, very small. As someone, at any given night at Hamilton, there are like 1,200 people in an audience, right? So multiply the classic thing that was always said about it, like the least successful TV show on any given night will be seen by more people. This is, I think, less true than it was, but more people than have ever seen a Shakespeare play in the history, since Shakespeare's first productions were staged. But Hamilton kind of breaks that mold, and these shows, which run for 20 years, break that mold. And I'm just saying that culturally in New York, all of this was of a piece with the kind of New York's just fantastic. It's safe, it's clean, it's fun. There are places to eat, there are things to do. You got to go there. It's pulsing with energy and enthusiasm. And you go see a show or two. And it doesn't matter how much it costs. Like Hamilton, to get into Hamilton generally cost, there was something like an average ticket price of $420 per ticket.
But they were going for,
right.
800.
But I'm saying average. But I'm
right.
saying, the average between, they're not just scalping and all that. You couldn't get a ticket, and if you could. And so it was all of a piece with New York's just unbelievable self-confidence about itself and its future and its present, and everything was just great somehow.
Yeah, and you would see that in just when you walk through Times Square. I mean, if you walk through the intersection between Broadway and 7th Avenue on a typical day, I would walk through that scrum every single day on my way home from work, because would take the 42nd Street to Times Square subway station. I'd walk through Times Square. It was what you would see there was both wild, interesting, and terrifying.
Yeah, it was like there's a concept in economics or sociology called the catastrophic success. And New York had started achieving what you might call the catastrophic success, which is that it was so popular and it was so great and it was so that it was impregnable. It's Yogi Berra once said of a restaurant that it's so crowded nobody goes there anymore. It was like that. The last place you wanted to be was walking through Times Square because it was so busy and alive. Now I work just south of Times Square. You walk through it and it is horrifying and heartbreaking, because it's you, 3 guys in an Elmo costume, and 5 junkies lying on the sidewalk. And then some Japanese guy taking photographs. That's it, blocks and blocks. And this was a place that they had to shut 3/4 of it down and increase the size of the sidewalks because there was nowhere for anybody to walk. It had gotten so crazy busy. So that was the condition of Broadway before the virus hit. And it's and the condition of the city before the virus hit. Now, there were other signs of trouble in New York City. If you wanted to talk, I know you talked to Rayhan and Ron Salam and Nicole Gelinas about this. That there were worrisome signs that New York was not going in the right direction. Sort of increase in quality of life problems, dirtier subways, general feeling less safety. And stuff like that. All this, of course, has now been wildly exacerbated by the end of Eyes on the Street, the fact that there are people out and about, and so the streets have largely been taken over by people who are street people rather than ordinary civilians, and Midtown is a ghost town because no one is working in the office buildings and all of that. And so what you got there was things aren't going necessarily as great as people seem to think they are, and it's like at some point the music's going to stop, and we're going to all have to deal with the consequences of what's going on here. And then the music didn't just stop; the music stopped, and the record was smashed, and the record player was thrown in the garbage. And here we are, dealing with the consequences, and the consequences for this industry. Again, this 100,000 jobs. The steel industry in the United States doesn't employ many more than 100,000 people. If you think about it, it doesn't sound like that many people out of 330 million people, but that is a major American employer,
right?
Or employment system that was literally cut off. It was folded up and put into hibernation.
And the core of it is what you described a moment ago. 1,200 people piling themselves into a theater twice a day, a few days a week, once a day, 1 or 2 days a week. But that's it. Some theaters, 1,200 people, some theaters, 500 people, whatever. It's a few hundred people piling in cheek to jowl to have this shared experience. And can you imagine when people are going to be comfortable doing that again? I mean, they're experimenting with it in London. They were, at least this last week or two, from what I understand, where they were opening theaters, although now because of the new phase of lockdowns in the UK that they've shut it all down. But in the last couple of weeks, they were experimenting with opening theaters at half capacity. How does this industry work like that when you have those kinds of constraints?
This, I think, is the ultimate question for your podcast that experience is only going to answer, which is, what are the long-term psychological consequences of this period? And there's been a general sense that, like, the minute that it's all over, everyone's going to flock back, right? They're going to flock back to theaters, flock back to movie theaters. They're going to go to amusement parks. Everyone's going to, pent-up demand is going to be crazy, and it's going to be fantastic. And there's just going to be, it'll be like the roaring 20s after the pandemic and World War I. It's just going to be amazing. And I don't know if that's really true in the way that people hope that it's going to be true. If we go through a year and a half or close to a year and a half, having come to or a lot of people feeling like other people are carriers of contagion and threat. The notion that we're just going to be back in, LAX, standing on a 500-person security line, shuffling 6 inches next to another person. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we're infinitely adaptable and we'll just forget and it'll be over. But I think it's going to take a couple of years for people to get back into the mode of not implicitly thinking, or enough people, let's say, because not everyone's going to feel this way, but enough people to feel, I don't know, it's too close. Or you sit down and someone's too close to you, right?
Yeah, this is this argument of Nicholas Christakis, who just wrote this very good book, or published a very good book called Apollo's Era, where he basically says even if the vaccines are effective, but they're not 100% effective, and assuming you don't have 100% adoption, it's one thing to be comfortable in your immediate social circles. It's something entirely different to walk into a theater with hundreds of strangers and be packed in there with them, or walk into a sports arena with tens of thousands of strangers. You just do the math.
Right. Well, think about the math there, because, doing things like going to the theater can be kind of unpleasant. Broadway theaters were built at a different time. That, just like airplanes, if you have a successful show, you want to pack people in like sardines. Every available piece of space that can be filled by a seat that would be bought, paid for, is profit. So you want to put as many seats in as possible. You want to, have people come in as much as possible. So what would it mean for the theater to accommodate people who are not going to be comfortable sitting directly next to somebody they don't know and literally having their arms, sharing an armrest with somebody they don't know? Well, so let's say the theater has to have half as many seats as it had before, and the seats are spread. They can do this with theater. These seats are not, iron, welded into the floor. Well, then they're cutting their not only their profit, but they're cutting the possible gain in half. And then how are they going to make money? Because a lot of these things don't make that much money. They make money off T-shirt, they make money off this, but so what are they going to do? Raise ticket price? Well, then there's some point at which you can't raise ticket. You can be Hamilton and sell a ticket for $800, or Bruce Springsteen on Broadway and sell a ticket for $800. But if you're bringing in, a new production of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, people aren't going to pay $800. So can you have a show in a theater built for 1,500 people that has 500 seats? Yes. Can you do it profitably? Probably not. So what happens then? Now, people aren't really in this game to make a lot of excess money. That's not exactly what it is. Like, actors need to make money, stagehands need to make money, producers want to make some money. But people, it's not actually like you're going into this because it's a gold, like, because you want to make
right. It's not a big tech IPO.
Right. So the answer is there'll be some of it, but then you have to start ratcheting back all sorts of expectations. Like, the producers will go to the stagehand union and say, we can't have 20 people working backstage on this show because we can now only afford 10 extra hands because we only sell 500 tickets instead of 1,200 tickets. And are the stagehand unions going to say, that's fine with us? We'll let you have, we'll see to it that our union now is 50% unemployment when it was at full employment before. I mean, all kinds of incredibly difficult conversations are going to happen that aren't necessarily going to go the way people want them to. And you don't even know if it's going to work. Or it will work, so none of this is necessary because Christakis will be wrong and I'll be wrong, and people will be like, yeah, I'm going to the ballpark. I'll do anything. I've been cooped up inside for 2 years. So, that's enough. I have the vaccine. I'm vaccinated. My family is vaccinated. I'm not going to give it to anybody. And no one who has it is going to give it to me. But what happens when it's flu? What happens when someone sneezes next to you? Like that. Right. That's what I don't really get.
So we're talking about the demand side. What you're basically describing is consumers, audience, attendees, and whether or not they'll have the same demand level for it, for all the reasons you're saying. What about the supply side? Could you describe a little bit about how the ecosystem works of talent and, both acting talent, production talent? All these people travel from around the world to make it in New York City theater. And how much does the industry depend on that ecosystem being at full capacity?
Well, this is a very interesting question because there are many competing factors, right? So the presumption that, we're just going to reopen and it's going to reopen and then all the shows that were hits before are going to come back and be hits, I think, again, is very questionable. Like, the bloom is off the rose on some of these things. The feeling that you have to see Hamilton or you'll die is vitiated when you haven't had 2 years to see Hamilton. It reopens and whatever that pressure was isn't really there anymore. That cultural pressure has lessened. You'll need new things that people are desperate to see that will be created. And maybe there's been a lot of creative ferment during this downtime because people have nothing to do. So they might be writing, they might be coming up with brilliant things. But Broadway is going to go through a tough period, having earned $2 billion in ticket sales in 2019. There is no way that it's going to get anywhere near that in the first year that it comes back, because I think the glamour of, I guess I should go see the Moulin Rouge musical, which seemed exciting in early 2020 when it opened, but now it's fall of 2021. It's like, I guess I could see it or not. I don't know. I mean, how is that excitement going to be generated? At the same time, if New York goes through a terrible downshift in real estate values, in commercial real estate, this and that and the other, one of the positive ancillary consequences would be that it would suddenly again be affordable for a creative class of young people who have increasingly found it impossible to live in this city and create work in this city to come in. They can rent some space and start a black box theater somewhere. Maybe there'll be deregulatory efforts made by the city council or the city of New York to encourage this because there's going to be so much excess capacity that's one of the things that cities always seem to do when things go bad is they try to help the creative class to make the place jazzier. So, if half the spaces in Midtown storefronts and stuff are empty, what if somebody puts a theater in a storefront, puts up felt and whatever, and black curtains and some sound baffles, and stages something like that is actually that's how off-Broadway and off-Broadway were created in the from the 50s to the 80s, were the guy Howard Ashman, who wrote The Little Mermaid and Aladdin and Little Shop of Horrors and stuff. He had a theater in the 1970s called the WPA Theater, which had been a Chinese restaurant, and he just sort of opened it and rented
amazing.
it, which you can't.
Classic New York
Yeah.
story. I mean, it's
Yeah.
amazing.
And there has been very little of that lately because it's financially impossible. And also you had this weird feeling. It's like, who needs it? If it's good, it'll come here. They'll
Yeah.
make it happen. They'll do it in these other theaters. But you could have a kind of creative ferment that is born of financial necessity as the city kind of collapses. And then that will also help revive it.
Right. So, there was a sense like what you're describing earlier that it can't be screwed up. During the heyday, it couldn't be screwed up. 5 terms of Giuliani and Bloomberg, the city was basically run well. In many respects, it was transformed, that even if you had de Blasio as mayor, it didn't matter. The city couldn't be screwed up. And you said the city was starting to be screwed up. And then obviously coronavirus exacerbated it. But it sounds like what you're saying is, but the Broadway industry was really screwed up, not because the city was in worse shape, but because this pandemic just devastated it.
Right. Well, we know the industries in America that are in terrible danger because of the pandemic, not just here but elsewhere. Right. We know restaurants nationwide, or in most more populous states, are in catastrophic, potentially life-ending positions. We know movie theater, exhibitors. Right, malls are in terrible shape.
Mm-hmm.
Movie theaters, AMC movie theaters, the largest chain in the country, says it's going to go broke at the end of January.
And basically, any industry that requires lots of people to be in tight spaces together.
Yeah, for a considerable period of time. Now, that isn't to say that there isn't going to be a movie theater industry. If AMC goes bankrupt and someone comes in for pennies on the dollar and buys up their leases or their spaces and reopens when it reopens, they won't have the legacy costs that AMC has, and they can maybe make something fresh and new that AMC was unable to do. It's not that it'll go away, because that's a big company, but the individual small businessmen who run restaurants and like the ancillary businesses, say around Times Square, a deli, a place where you go in to buy a Snapple iced tea or something, like, they may collapse and no one's helping them, right? We didn't have a second stimulus bill, or hasn't happened yet. No one's helping any of those people. So the interesting question is, can they screw up the recovery of New York after coronavirus? Absolutely. In fact, I'd be surprised if they didn't, because the way you don't screw it up is do what you can to get out of the way of people trying to restore the economic life of the city. But that is not how the politicians in and around New York function. They function by getting their mitts into everything and screwing around with things and saying, no, that you can't, you have 800 square feet. You're going to need 3 fire exits. You're not going to have 3 fire exits. You better blow, you're going to have to tear down a wall to the street in order to, or you have to do this, you have to do that. The thing that's necessary is, like, we're in crisis. Let people do what they have to do to open a business. And then you have this entire city bureaucracy that's like, oh, just a moment, buddy. There's been some of this good, right? Which is like, they said, okay, fine, open up these shacks outside your restaurants,
right,
to keep
outdoor
going.
Dining,
and
outdoor
that was sort
dining,
of amazing,
quote unquote.
Yeah, but it was amazing because it sort of happened in a way that nothing ever happens here, which is just happened in a week. Because everything, but let this come back. It's like, no, I have a better idea. What we should do is everyone should be forced to run things with net carbon neutrality. So then the city will be net carbon neutral, and we'll be a model for the rest of the planet. And then, no one will ever be able to open anything because they'll be so busy putting in LEED certified air conditioning equipment that costs 5 times what they can afford. So could they screw it up? Could they screw up the reopening of the theaters? Yeah, they could be like, oh, you know what? Just now that since you're reopening in 6 weeks, put in 5 elevators for the handicapped. I mean, I'm just not that any of these things isn't a wonderful thing to do or could be a wonderful thing to do. It's just that's what interventionist liberal politicians do with their power. So yeah, Broadway could be in a terrible condition. And the weird thing is that I love going to the theater, and I don't think there's a larger American drama here, but there is a New York City drama. New York City is the most important city in America. And as I say, this is the unique feature of New York culturally. This is the thing.
But if there's demand for it,
Yeah.
there's clearly demand in the tune of billions of dollars for this unique feature of New York. Could this unique feature live somewhere else? If New York is going to screw up the post-corona reopening of live theater, couldn't this industry migrate somewhere else? Like, why does it have to be here?
No one has ever figured out how to do it elsewhere. I mean, there are bits and pieces, but they all depend on the core, right? So obviously we're now going to go through a huge experiment in this question about financial services, right? New York has been the center of financial services in the United States pretty much since the founding of the country. And, back in the 60s and 70s, 80s, there was all this talk, oh, you know what? Banks will go to Charlotte. They'll go to Research Triangle Park, and they're not going to stay here and deal with all these taxes and everything like that. And then the crime rate dropped and people wanted to live here. And suddenly all this notion that businesses were going to flee New York City vanished. But now it's back. It's back with a vengeance. So you have that possibility, which is the decline of the financials. And if that goes, since that throws off, you want to talk about throwing off cash for the city. I mean, right. The theater throws off cash for the financial services industry is the city. Like, there is no other industry in the city except for Broadway, as far as I can tell. And you're talking about tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars gone over 10 or 15 years, and the city can never recover from that. But if you're talking about the theater, what New York has is the theater infrastructure that nobody else has. It has these 35, 40 buildings. It has these spaces. They are economically inefficient spaces, right? They have a huge footprint. They're often not part of another structure. So they're single use, big. They have a lot of property taxes they have to pay. You can't just take one you can build a small version of one, but other places don't build them because they don't have the density that you could say, okay, I'm going to have 66 million tourists here in a year, so I should need these facilities to entertain them. The only person who's ever done that is Walt Disney, right? That's what Disney World is a place that was, so Disney World was created.
Meaning he made it out of thin air.
He made it out of thin air, and it is a theater, right? It's like it's 16 theaters and all these attractions, but basically, yeah. I mean, you could do it in Orlando, right? Or you can do it, or Vegas, which has them because it also is a kind of destination place for entertainment. But willing it into being somewhere else is not practical because this is an expensive thing to build, the theater, with the seats and a balcony and up to fire code with lights. And also, it also often in fallow times, like these places can stay closed for 6 months at a time and not generate any revenue. So you also have to have an industry that is built to withstand that, which is one of the reasons why everything hasn't, the great organizations of the theater, the Schubert organization or Jude Jamson or something, haven't gone bankrupt because they, unlike a lot of other industries, actually have experience with what to do when suddenly you have no revenue coming in from something that's supposed to be producing revenue.
One other tangentially related topic that you and I have discussed is whether or not, even if Broadway could come back, something has happened during the pandemic that may or may not have anything to do with the actual pandemic, which is the debate over social justice, the debate over history and interpretations of American history that led you to believe in a telephone conversation we had, I guess it was last week, where you said that even if Broadway comes back, I'm not even could Hamilton even be made now? If Lin-Manuel Miranda and what's his name, Jeff Seller, were out pitching Hamilton now, would the industry be willing to get behind it?
Right. So Hamilton was as fashion forward as you could get in multicultural America, since it posits that the founding fathers can be played by Lin-Manuel Miranda as Puerto Rican, Daveed Diggs is who played Jefferson is black. Jefferson was black. Aaron Burr was black.
Leslie Odom Jr.
Leslie Odom Jr.
plays
right.
plays
So the
Aaron
whole
Burr.
thing was this was the recapturing of the American dream or the American experiment with a multicultural eye. That was the whole genius of its presentation. That it was this hyper patriotic, celebration of American spirit and ingenuity, and America's young, scrappy, and hungry, and just full of love for the American experiment. And now we've had the 1619 Project, and every liberal and people are desperately trying to prove that Alexander Hamilton, who was an early opponent of slavery and a supporter of the manumission cause and all sorts of things, actually owned a slave or may have owned a slave or something like that, and so therefore is canceled like everybody else. So I don't know that it could be done, or it could be done the very quality that it had, which was this celebration of the United States from a new, more liberal understanding of the United States, would be interfered with by the ideological demands of the moment that were not present when he wrote it in 2014. I look at this and I think, the pressure is are you trying to produce a hit, or are you now trying to produce a hit while making sure that you have a black costume designer and an Asian choreographer, and that the cast is fully balanced in every possible way, those sorts of things, as opposed to I'm just trying to produce something that people want to go see, interfere with. It's already a near impossibility to create a successful cultural product, and now you're overlaying all of these ideological demands and responsibilities. There's a tiny theater down in Tribeca called The Flea. The Flea is a weird model, does revivals and stuff, and so the Flea Theater has a small staff, and then it brings people on as associates who are not paid, but they can do their work there. They're paid per show or whatever. They're not on staff. And so it was at some point one of the heads of the Flea was racist or hadn't been good, hadn't treated black people well, and he was dismissed, and somebody else was fired, and somebody else was hired who was to run it, and then the people who were associated with the Flea are still saying it's not fair because you haven't hired us, and everyone isn't balanced. And the general impression and tenor from quotes from people who were fighting against the Flea's existence are, we're here to burn this all down. We're going to burn this all down. It's this little off-Broadway theater, a nonprofit, and the whole point is we must destroy it. I would like to destroy it because it is not doing what I think it must do at this time. And if that's true of this tiny little theater that nobody really cares about, God only knows what happens to any production of anything that can be criticized for any reason and canceled therefore.
A friend of mine in the industry points out that, unlike the Hollywood system, which has this big finance machine that gets behind films, many of these shows are like the Flea, they're these one-off entrepreneurs who try to get something going, and they live from project to project in the hope that one hits. Lin-Manuel Miranda was that one time.
That's all theater is. That's certainly all the commercial theater is every single production is an entrepreneurial effort. It's a small business. It gets 30 or 40 people to invest in it, unless it's being done by Disney, which obviously is a corporate chieftain that doesn't farm out its production pays for its own development and production. 40 people go in to invest, and they're not looking for a big return. They just want to be part of this. And every now and then, if you go in, you hit it big. I have a friend who's an investor in Hamilton, whose kids' college tuitions are going to be paid for by it. He doesn't have much of it. He has 1% of it or something like that, or even less. But he never expected that. he didn't put much money in. He's a friend of Lin-Manuel Miranda's, and he will now, he hit it. It's like like being part of buying Apple at 20, and if you bought 10 shares, you would be in a lot better shape, right? Than if you bought 10,000 shares, you're a billionaire, and if you bought 10 shares, you're still better off than you were if you didn't buy 10 shares. Every theatrical production is such an effort, and if you start overlaying political correctness on it, it's a very fragile thing. It's a fragile ecosystem, and it's not. Yeah, and what's more, also, it doesn't have the wherewithal to buy people off. Like in Hollywood studio system, they can create diversity programs. They can create, they can have 10 people on set to shadow thus and such. And yeah, it increases the budgets by $5 million per movie. But that's fine because it keeps the shareholders happy, and people aren't going to scream at a meeting. And then the people who might boycott you, or suddenly they have friends who are working in the industry and they want to leave it alone. Theater doesn't have those margins. Theater has no margins.
No cushion.
Yeah.
No cushion.
Yeah.
Okay, just in closing, there's one thing you could prescribe to restart Broadway post-corona, what would it be?
Wow, that's interesting. I would say that the thing that could get people back to Broadway is if there were a sense of the date certain. Bring in 10 huge stars to do shows for 6 months. There is one such show that has been in the works now for a year and a half. That's Hugh Jackman is going to do a revival of The Music Man. But
Which was in the works.
Was in the works. It was canceled, postponed. It's supposed to be
because of
next
Corona.
year because of Corona. Right. Should have opened in May or something like that. So he is a huge star, and he's a Broadway, and he's a great singer and a dancer, and so everybody will want to see that. But if you had 10, if you had Bette Midler doing something, and you had Barbara Streisand doing something, and you had, I don't know, Anna Kendrick, who was in Pitch Perfect doing, if you had 10 major movie, across the board stars who were all appearing in Broadway at the same moment, in part to help this, and also in part because they also could use some kind of a participation in a big cultural moment to get their careers back, generating heat and enthusiasm after this period. That would be my prescription. And and who cares what it costs? Or do
make
it so
happen.
it's all make it happen. Yeah.
Right. Well, I was expecting you to end on a crushingly morose note.
I'm sorry. And
as you normally tee up for us, a daily dose of crushing morosity on the Commentary Magazine podcast.
Yes.
But you shockingly, out of character, have like an upbeat plan.
Well, that's because I didn't have a plan. So now you know that I'm actually, in my heart, a cockeyed optimist, but I'm a studied pessimist.
John Podhoretz, thank you for joining us. Hopefully we'll have you back.
That would be great. As you know, this is like my favorite podcast aside from my own. So,
all right,
there you go.
So I'm sticking to weekly, but I'm not doing 5 days a week yet. Take care. Thank you. That's our show for today. If you want to follow John Podhoretz's work, subscribe to Commentary Magazine. Go to commentarymagazine.com and also subscribe to the Commentary Magazine podcast. You can also follow Commentary on Twitter @Commentary. If you have questions or ideas for future episodes of Post Corona, tweet at me @DanSenor. Post Corona is produced by Ilan Benatar. Our researcher is Sophie Pollack. Until next time, I'm your host, Dan Senor.